The salt air stung my lungs as I stepped onto the deck, a metallic chill crawling up my spine. The yacht was sleek and imposing, every polished surface gleaming under the faint, gray dawn. I, Corelia, chief marine engineer, had spent months ensuring that every system was seaworthy, every bolt properly certified, every hull plate meticulously aligned. I had believed that my diligence could protect this vessel, protect me. I was wrong. Leo's hand rested lightly on mine, the glass of amber liquid glinting in the dim morning light. His smile was calm, almost tender, and yet something in the tilt of his lips didn't reach his eyes. Those eyes, cold and calculating, scanned me as if I were a curious puzzle to be dismantled. I had loved this man, trusted him with both my heart and the technical blueprints I had labored over. Now, as he held the glass, I understood that my trust had been a weapon in his hands, wielded with surgical precision. "The yacht is overinsured, Corelia," he said, his voice flat, almost casual. It was not the tone of a man sharing a financial plan. It was the tone of a man delivering a verdict. Maeve confirmed the structural weaknesses. "It will look like a design failure. I need the payout to cover debts. Your insistence on certified, ethical parts, it's costly. It's unsustainable." I stared at him, trying to reconcile the man I had married with the one who now manipulated our shared work into a justification for my end. My chest tightened. Betrayal is not a single strike. It's a series of sharp cuts, repeated and precise, until the fabric of your trust unravels. And that was what this was. Leo had chosen profit over me, over the integrity of our craft. And Maeve, his estranged sister-in-law, whose talent had once earned my grudging admiration, had sided with him, using knowledge I had taught her to aid in this betrayal. The deck beneath my feet seemed to sway, as though the yacht itself understood the treachery. My limbs felt impossibly heavy, my mind clouded by the whiskey he had so kindly offered. I knew the moment of my death would arrive with the gentle inevitability of the tide. There was no heroics, no struggle, just the calm, cruel precision of a man who had decided my end was worth the profit. I focused instead on the reflections across the polished surfaces, the distorted mirror of a life I had built and now saw shattered. In the gleam of chrome railings and the sheen of the varnished deck, I saw myself. The meticulous engineer, the devoted partner, the woman whose vision and dedication had been weaponized. And I realized then, even in that suspended, suffocating haze, that death would not claim all of me. Something harder, sharper, more relentless had awakened. I would not let this end be the final chapter. The version of Corelia who had trusted without reservation was gone. In her place stood a version of me forged by betrayal, a version whose memory, whose foresight, and whose knowledge of the future could dismantle the empire Leo and Maeve sought to build. They had calculated every risk, every eventuality except for one, that I could see beyond their schemes, that I could anticipate, counter, and ultimately survive. As the fuse burned near the base of the mast, I allowed the world to tilt around me. The icy wind whipped against my face, the taste of salt and steel filling my senses. And in that moment of apparent surrender, I promised myself that the next time I walked onto a deck, it would be on my terms. The yacht could burn. The insurance could pay. Leo and Maeve would have underestimated the woman whose mind had never been bound by loyalty to the reckless. And in the echo of my own heartbeat, I knew it. Survival would not be accidental. It would be strategic, precise, and absolute. The world went dark, not with pain, but with purpose. I died that day, yes, but in death, I found the clarity that life had denied me. I woke to the familiar tang of salt and engine oil, the clatter of wrenches, and the low hum of diesel engines filling my ears. My hands, once calloused from precision welding and torque adjustments, now held the tools of a younger, less experienced self. I was 22, a fledgling marine engineer full of ambition and awe at the vastness of the ocean and the craft that allowed humanity to navigate it. The date, imprinted in my mind, was June 5th, 2023, a day before the storm of betrayal that had nearly claimed my life. The dry dock smelled of varnish and rust, the scent of progress and labor intermingling with the salty breeze rolling off the harbor. I moved with a sense of purpose, my knowledge of the future lending a weight to each step. The world seemed ordinary, oblivious to the treachery that would come, but I knew the currents beneath its calm surface. My mind immediately sought out Finn, an older, steady presence in the docks, a man whose hands bore the calluses of decades guiding vessels safely to harbor, whose eyes missed nothing, whose loyalty had been tested and proven time and again. I had underestimated him once, in the life I had lost. Leo had dismissed him as slow and old-fashioned, scoffing at the caution and care Finn demanded. Yet Finn had been the rock against which I had leaned in moments of doubt, the silent guardian who ensured that my work, and by extension my life, remained intact. I found him overseeing a routine repair on a small ferry, his posture relaxed but attentive, every movement precise. There was an ease in the way he moved, a rhythm that spoke of years spent observing tides, torque, and wind patterns, an instinct honed into art. I did not approach as a subordinate asking for guidance, nor as a young engineer seeking instruction. I approached with foresight and a plan. There was a critical defect in the main propulsion system of a ferry Leo was about to acquire, a flaw that Maeve would help him conceal in the coming months. Latent microfractures in the propeller shaft, minute but catastrophic under stress, would ensure failure in high seas. Lives would be at risk if no one intervened. My mind had catalogued the sequence. The purchase, the installation, the failure, steps all predestined unless disrupted. Finn noticed my presence before I spoke. He did not look surprised, only curious, the faint crease of concern on his weathered face betraying the depth of his attentiveness. I conveyed the information without embellishment, letting the gravity of the truth settle between us. It was not merely a technical detail, it was a warning, a moral imperative. Lives mattered more than profit, more than contracts, more than Leo's ambition. There was no rush in his response, only measured contemplation, the kind that comes from a man whose decisions carried tangible consequences. His gaze lingered on me, not with judgment, but with an unspoken acknowledgement of shared responsibility. I felt it then, the trust, fragile yet formidable, that forms the foundation of every alliance worth having. Finn would act, not because I demanded it, but because the weight of the truth demanded it. Together, silently, we traced the flow of risk, the vulnerabilities masked by deceit, the gaps that only an ethical observer could exploit. I felt the tension ease, a strange comfort settling into my chest. For the first time in years, I was no longer alone against the tide. This quiet alignment with Finn, built on mutual understanding rather than obligation, felt like a tether to reality in a world I knew could be ruthless. Even as I catalogued the defects, calculated interventions, and planned contingencies, I sensed a new current stirring between us, a subtle energy in the shared focus, the brief touches of hands over engine schematics, the unspoken recognition of parallel dedication. It was not yet romance, but it was something heavier, something anchoring. Finn's presence was a safeguard, both practical and profoundly human. In that moment, I understood the magnitude of the opportunity this second chance afforded me. I could not only prevent the disaster that would have sunk the ferry, but I could also reshape the very currents of my life. Finn was more than a protector of ships. He was a potential harbor for a heart long battered by betrayal. And I, reborn in foresight and determination, would navigate the next chapters with his steady presence at my side. The harbor hummed around us, ordinary yet electric, as I committed every detail to memory, every flaw to record, every contingency to plan. Leo had underestimated the currents. Maeve had misjudged the tides. And I, Corelia, was finally awake, ready to steer both the ships and my destiny with hands unshaken, eyes clear, and heart cautiously, quietly tethered to a man whose integrity was as solid as steel. The dry dock buzzed with routine energy, but I felt the undercurrent of something far more urgent. Every ship, every hull, every engine waiting for repair or inspection seemed suddenly alive with possibility and peril. I moved among them like a ghost who knew what would come, my mind mapping Leo's future shortcuts and Maeve's silent complicity. I had the knowledge of disaster, the foresight of betrayal, and I had Finn. He was there before me, as always, calm and precise, his hands methodically checking torque on a propeller shaft, his gaze sweeping over the ship as though he could see its innermost skeleton. Watching him work, I felt a strange mix of admiration and grounding relief. Finn did not rush. He did not overstate. He simply moved through danger as if he belonged there, a natural anchor in the chaos I carried inside me. I approached him slowly, careful not to break the rhythm of his work. Even without speaking, there was a dialogue between us, a conversation of glances, gestures, and the quiet language of shared responsibility. I pointed toward the shaft, tracing the minuscule stress lines with my finger, careful to avoid touching his hands, yet feeling an odd pull in proximity. The ship itself seemed to shiver under our attention, as if aware that the right decisions could mean life, the wrong ones disaster. Finn's attention never faltered. He leaned closer, inspecting the metal, his shoulder brushing mine in the narrow work corridor. It was a brief, fleeting touch, but it carried an unspoken weight, a reassurance that he was present in both body and intention. I felt a flicker of warmth, a sensation I had long denied myself after years of betrayal and calculated deceit. I spoke in low, precise tones, outlining the defects Leo intended to exploit, Maeve's role in masking them, the sequence that would lead to catastrophic failure if unchecked. Finn absorbed every word, nodding occasionally, his brow furrowing with concentration. I could see the gears turning in his mind, the strategies forming silently, unspoken but palpable. There was trust in his presence, the kind that does not need affirmation, it simply exists. Hours passed as we moved through the ship, inspecting, documenting, planning interventions. Each touch of his hand guiding a tool, each subtle shift in stance as he adjusted an alignment, was a reminder that this man could be counted on in ways Leo never could. He was deliberate, protective, and steadfast, a harbor in a world of storms. And I, for the first time in years, allowed myself to feel a fragile sense of hope. There was an intimacy in our shared focus, subtle yet undeniable. A brief brush of our arms while balancing on a narrow catwalk, the warmth radiating from him as we leaned together over schematics. The way he looked at me, not with desire, but with a protective attention that made my chest tighten. I realized that connection could be both professional and personal, that trust could be the foundation for something deeper. By the time the sun began to dip below the harbor skyline, the ferry's critical systems were cataloged, our plans for intervention detailed, and the air between us charged with quiet understanding. Finn glanced at me briefly, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, as though acknowledging the unspoken bond forming in these shared hours of responsibility. I allowed myself a small smile in return, careful not to overstate, careful to savor the first hint of warmth after the long, cold betrayal that Leo and Maeve had left in my life. For the first time since I had awoken into this second chance, I felt that the tides of my life were no longer entirely at the mercy of others. With Finn by my side, guiding, watching, protecting, I could navigate the looming dangers, rewrite the course of the ships, and, perhaps, open my heart cautiously to someone who might prove to be the anchor I had long needed. The harbor hummed softly in the evening light, engines settling into quiet. I exhaled, leaning slightly against the rail as Finn's presence lingered near me, strong and steady. In that moment, I realized that this partnership, built on trust, competence, and quiet intimacy, was the first step toward reclaiming both my work and my life. And maybe, just maybe, it could be the start of something more than safety, something that could finally hold my heart. The harbor smelled of salt and diesel, but beneath it was the faint tang of rain on metal, a scent that always made me feel alive and alert. I moved carefully along the dock, my hands tracing the cool steel railings, noting the worn ropes and the subtle tension in the mooring lines. Everything was alive with motion, possibility, and, if handled wrong, catastrophe. Finn was already there, crouched by the hull of a smaller vessel, checking bolts and hydraulic connections with the sort of meticulous care that made me want to watch forever. I lingered at the edge, observing him, studying the way he leaned into the work, his shoulders broad, his hands confident, precise. I realized my heartbeat picked up a little each time our eyes met across the space, each glance carrying unspoken understanding. We moved together along the dock, inspecting, measuring, marking. Our conversation was minimal, brief technical notes, confirmations, but it wasn't necessary. There was a rhythm between us now, a shared cadence built on unspoken trust. When I leaned over to examine a corroded fitting, Finn's arm brushed mine. Just the slightest contact, but it sent an unexpected warmth shooting through me. I reminded myself to focus. Lives depended on this, not lingering glances. Yet, every time his hand shifted slightly to guide mine, or his shoulder bumped into me as he balanced on the uneven planks, it was a subtle assertion of presence. Protective. Steady. Reassuring. In the chaos that had defined my relationship with Leo, Finn's consistency was a revelation. I realized that physical proximity could be a language in itself, one I was only just beginning to understand. We paused near the edge of the dock, the sea reflecting the muted colors of the evening sky. Finn adjusted a cable, his hand brushing mine again, this time lingering slightly longer. My breath hitched, and I fought to keep my composure, reminding myself that this was about safety, about preventing disaster, about stopping Leo and Maeve from exploiting my work. And yet, I couldn't ignore the way his steady gaze seemed to pierce through my defenses, as if he could see the fear and hope tangled together inside me. "You're tense," he said softly, not as a question, but as an observation. His voice carried across the small distance between us, calm and grounding. I swallowed, realizing my hands had been trembling slightly. "I've had reason to be," I admitted, letting the words escape in a whisper. My eyes met his, and in that moment, I felt the first real spark of connection. Not desire, exactly, but a recognition that here was someone I could rely on completely. The kind of trust one had thought impossible since Leo. Without thinking, I let my hand brush against his forearm, a small, deliberate gesture. He didn't pull away. Instead, he shifted slightly closer, the warmth of his body brushing against mine in the fading light. My chest tightened in a way I hadn't felt in years. Safety and protection had never felt so intimate. We returned to the vessel, working side by side, but now each touch carried weight. A guiding hand on a railing, a steadying brush on my back, a moment where our hands met over the tools. Every movement was professional, yet charged with a subtle current of unspoken connection. I realized that Finn's presence was more than protection. It was reassurance, desire, and an anchor all at once. By the time the night settled over the harbor, I felt both exhausted and exhilarated. The ferry's critical systems had been documented, preventative measures outlined, and the first steps taken to stop Leo's early schemes. And beneath it all, a quiet, growing awareness. I was not alone. Not in responsibility, not in this fight, and perhaps, tentatively, not in the stirrings of something tender and real. As Finn gathered his tools, our hands brushed one last time, lingering just a heartbeat longer than necessary. A silent promise seemed to pass between us, a promise of trust, protection, and perhaps, eventually, something more. The early morning fog rolled over the dock like a muted curtain, the water reflecting muted streaks of gray and silver. I could hear the low hum of engines warming in the distance, gulls squawking, and the faint creak of mooring lines as the tides shifted. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, the fabric stiff with dew, and stepped onto the planks, my boots making soft thuds against the damp wood. Every sound was amplified in the quiet of the harbor, a reminder that I was already alert, already alive with purpose. Finn was there before me, as always, crouched near the hull of a smaller vessel, hands covered in grease. His focus was magnetic. I watched him for a moment, noticing the small gestures, the precise way he tightened a bolt, the subtle shift in his weight as he leaned closer to inspect the alignment, the brief pause as he wiped his forehead and scanned the horizon. It was a choreography born of years on the water, and I felt an instinctive urge to be near him, not just for work but for the comfort of his presence. We moved along the dock in silence, inspecting lines, checking the stability of rails, noting the minor corrosion that, if left unattended, could escalate into something catastrophic. I had warned him about the critical defects in the ferry's propulsion system, and we were taking every precaution to prevent disaster. My mind, sharp as it always was, kept replaying the memory of Leo's betrayal, Maeve's complicit smirk, and the cold efficiency with which they had planned to profit from what should have been a safe, functional vessel. Every inspection now was a small victory, every preventative measure a tiny undoing of their reckless ambition. As I leaned over to check a bracket, Finn's hand brushed against mine. Accidental, surely, but enough to send a jolt through my arm, a warmth that traveled all the way to my chest. I caught my breath, but did not step back. Instead, I let the contact linger, just for a heartbeat, before continuing my work. His presence was calming, yet it stirred something deeper inside me, a realization that safety could also be comfort, that protection could be tender. We paused near the edge of the dock, where the ferry's reflection shimmered on the water. Finn adjusted a cable, his strong hands brushing mine again as we worked side by side. I felt a subtle electricity, a rhythm in the movements, each touch deliberate yet casual, natural in its intimacy. I could see the concern in his eyes, the quiet focus that never wavered. It made me feel protected, seen, valued. A feeling I had almost forgotten I could trust. "You've got a sharp eye," he said quietly, his voice low and steady. There was no flirtation in his tone, only acknowledgement, but it carried weight, a kind of approval I hadn't realized I craved. I glanced up at him, the light catching the angles of his face, and I caught the faintest shadow of a smile tugging at his lips. "I've learned from the best," I replied softly, letting the words hover in the cool air between us. My hand brushed his again as I reached for a tool, intentional this time, and he didn't move away. There was a slow, subtle synchronization to our movements, a growing intimacy that needed no words, only presence, touch, and the shared rhythm of purpose. The hours passed, and by the time the sun began to break through the fog, painting the harbor in streaks of gold, we had documented every flaw, marked every risk, and prepared for the first stage of intervention. Leo and Maeve's plans would not succeed, not while we were awake, alert, and aligned in purpose. And with each shared glance, each casual touch, I felt something else grow alongside our mission, a quiet, unwavering trust, a tentative closeness that promised more than professional respect. As we gathered our tools and began walking back along the dock, our hands brushed once more, lingering longer than necessary. I felt his steady warmth, and for the first time since Leo, I allowed myself a fleeting sense of safety, not just in our work, but in him. The harbor, the fog, the water, all of it faded to the background, leaving only Finn and me, side by side, anchored in a growing connection that was both subtle and undeniable. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to believe that some people, some touches, and some hearts could truly be trusted. The morning sun burned through the mist, painting the dock in gold and silver. I could smell salt and machine oil, hear the distant clank of hulls against the pier, and feel the subtle vibration of engines warming for the day. Finn stood nearby, leaning casually against a railing, scanning the repairs we'd completed yesterday. Even in the harsh glare, he looked effortless, strong, capable, and impossibly grounded. My heart gave a little leap I didn't attempt to hide. I walked toward him, checking the alignment of a mooring line, my hand brushing the cold metal. He stepped closer under the guise of helping me hold the line taut. Our fingers met, just for a second, but that second stretched and throbbed with something unspoken. I glanced up, expecting him to pull away, but his eyes met mine, steady, intense, and quietly amused. There was a teasing spark in them, subtle but undeniable, and I felt my chest tighten. We worked side by side, our movements slowly synchronizing. I handed him a wrench, and his fingers lingered over mine longer than necessary. "You're not afraid of hard work," he said quietly, voice low, carrying a warmth that made my pulse hitch. I felt a faint heat rise to my cheeks. "Neither are you," I replied, trying to keep my tone casual, even as the tension between us thickened like the fog curling over the water. Finn leaned closer under the pretense of inspecting a joint, his shoulder brushing mine. I felt the subtle shift in his stance, the almost imperceptible pressure, as if he was closing the space intentionally. My breath caught. I knew the feeling. Electric, charged, a promise of more, but I forced my attention back to the task at hand. Still, every brush of his hand against mine, every graze of our arms, felt deliberate, magnetic. We paused to assess the hull, crouched side by side. His hand hovered over mine for the slightest moment longer than necessary as he adjusted a sensor. My fingers twitched under his touch, craving the reassurance of his strength. I dared a glance, and he offered a small, knowing smile, one that hinted at recognition, intimacy, and something tenderly protective. I swallowed hard, aware of the rhythm between us. Quiet, deliberate, charged. "Careful with that," he murmured, as I leaned over to tighten a bolt. His hand brushed my back lightly, guiding me without words, and my body responded instinctively, leaning into the warmth and solidity he offered. There was no rush, no urgency, only a slow, simmering closeness that made the cold morning air feel like a private cocoon. By the time we finished, the fog had lifted, leaving the water shimmering under the sun. We walked toward the small office at the end of the dock, and our hands brushed again, this time deliberately. I felt his fingers graze mine, playful but firm, and I didn't pull away. Instead, I let the contact linger, letting a smile curve my lips. He caught my gaze, and for a heartbeat, the world around us, the water, the engines, Leo's looming betrayal, fell away. "Funny," I said softly, leaning a fraction closer under the guise of inspecting his clipboard. "I feel safer with you than I've felt in years." Finn's lips curved into a brief, private smile. "Safety is my specialty," he replied, and I could hear the teasing undercurrent in his voice. My chest warmed, not from the sun, not from the work, but from the quiet intimacy growing between us, deliberate and unspoken. As we stood there, side by side, the sun sparkling on the water, I felt it, the first current of something stronger, deeper than camaraderie or professional respect. The warmth in his presence, the gentle insistence in his touch, the silent acknowledgement of mutual understanding. It anchored me. And for the first time since Leo and Maeve, I allowed myself to believe that some people, some hands, and some hearts could truly be trusted. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dock, painting everything in gold. The scent of salt water mixed with a faint tang of engine oil, grounding me in the familiar world of ships and machinery. But today, it wasn't just the work that made my pulse race. It was Finn. We were crouched together, inspecting the reinforced hull of the ferry that Leo had been trying to acquire. My hands brushed against his as we passed tools back and forth, and I felt the electricity of that contact linger. Every deliberate touch, his hand grazing mine as he steadied a wrench, my arm pressing against his shoulder when I leaned in, made the air around us heavier, warmer, charged with something unspoken. "Careful," he murmured softly, his breath brushing against my ear as he guided my hand over a sensitive component. I froze for a heartbeat, aware of the closeness, the strength of his body so near mine. My fingers twitched under his, craving the reassurance and steady warmth he radiated. I realized then that this wasn't just safety. This was trust, intimacy, the quiet thrill of being truly seen by someone who understood both my fears and my strengths. We straightened, standing side by side, shoulders nearly touching. The sun glinted off the water, casting shimmering reflections onto his face, highlighting the calm intensity in his eyes. He caught my gaze and held it, a small, private smile tugging at the corners of his lips. My chest tightened, my heart caught. I felt the urge to reach out, to brush my hand against his cheek, to close the gap I had been resisting. "You're too calm for someone with so much on her shoulders," he teased quietly, his fingers brushing mine as he adjusted a line. The touch was fleeting but deliberate, enough to make me shiver. I let a soft smile slip past my lips, feeling the tension in my body melt under his quiet warmth. As we moved toward the office to check the reports, our hands collided again, this time intentionally, his fingers curling around mine. I didn't pull away. Instead, I let my thumb brush against his, a subtle, teasing gesture that elicited a brief spark in his eyes. He leaned closer, ostensibly to read a figure on the clipboard, but I could feel the heat of his chest against mine. My breath hitched, my pulse quickened. "Corelia," he murmured, just above a whisper, his voice low and steady. The closeness was intoxicating, magnetic. Without thinking, I tilted my head, letting our foreheads brush together in a gentle, intimate gesture that spoke volumes more than words ever could. His hand lifted to cup my cheek, fingers brushing my hairline, warm and reassuring. When his lips met mine, it was deliberate and slow, a kiss that carried weight, comfort, and quiet promise. I leaned into him, feeling the solidity of his body anchoring mine, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to relax entirely, letting the waves of past betrayal wash away. The world narrowed to the rhythm of his heartbeat against mine, the safety of his embrace, and the undeniable connection that had been building between us. We pulled apart just enough to breathe, foreheads still touching, and I realized that no matter what Leo or Maeve tried, this closeness, this trust, this intimacy, was mine to keep. Finn wasn't just a protector of ships or docks, he was a protector of my heart. And as we stood there, side by side, I knew the tides of the heart had shifted irrevocably in his favor. The early morning mist hovered over the docks, softening the edges of the harbor and reflecting the first blush of sunlight on the water. I stood at the edge of the pier, my coat pulled tight against the cold breeze, and finally let myself exhale. Years of planning, foresight, and quiet observation had led to this moment. Leo and Maeve's reckless empire, the web of lies, shortcuts, and betrayals, was crumbling. The authorities had received the reports I had prepared, corroborated by Finn's meticulous documentation and the operational evidence he had gathered. Every flawed hull, every ignored safety protocol, every shady acquisition had been traced, logged, and exposed. Finn approached silently, as he always did, a solid presence at my side. The gentle rhythm of his boots against the wooden planks was a grounding sound, reminding me of the calm strength I had come to rely on. When I turned to him, his eyes held the same steady warmth that had guided me through every storm, literal and metaphorical. "You did it," he said softly, his voice carrying the quiet awe he rarely let show. His hand brushed mine as he gestured to the harbor, the contact light but electric. It sent a thrill through me, a mix of relief and something deeper that had been building for months. I realized that this triumph wasn't just about justice. It was about trust, intimacy, and the life I was reclaiming for myself. I let my fingers linger on his palm, feeling the callous strength of a man who had saved lives, not just ships, but mine. "We did it," I corrected, the words tasting of victory and permanence. Every failure they counted on, every shortcut, we caught it before it could hurt anyone. Finn's gaze softened, and he leaned closer under the pretense of examining a dock ledger, but I felt the heat of his body brush against mine. The tension that had simmered between us for months, through shared hours in repair bays, long nights of inspection, and stolen moments in quiet offices, finally had space to surface. I found myself inching closer, letting the warmth of his chest press against mine, letting my hand slide up to rest against his forearm. "You've always been brilliant," he murmured, fingers tracing a line along the back of my hand in a touch that was both tender and deliberate. My pulse quickened, my breath catching in the hollow of my throat. I had spent too long wary, cautious, preparing for betrayal, but Finn had been patient. He had been steadfast. And now, with the storm finally behind us, I could let myself feel. I tilted my head, letting our foreheads touch, letting him feel the weight of my exhaustion and the surge of triumph all at once. He responded with a soft, approving smile, his other hand rising to cup my cheek, fingers threading through my hair. His touch was grounding, safe, and fiercely intimate. I leaned into it, closing my eyes, letting the salt-kissed breeze mix with the heat of our proximity. And then he kissed me. It wasn't rushed, nor was it just a gesture of desire. It was deliberate, slow, and full of everything we had been building toward: trust, reliance, respect, and unspoken affection. My hands moved to his shoulders, pulling him closer, feeling the solid reassurance of his body against mine. His lips pressed with the certainty of someone who would never betray me, who had never wavered even when the world had. I responded, letting the tension of the past dissolve with each heartbeat against his chest. Years of fear, betrayal, and loss gave way to the profound realization that this, us, was unshakable. Finn didn't just protect me. He anchored me, grounded me, and loved me in the quietest, most steadfast way imaginable. We broke apart just enough to breathe, foreheads still pressed together, breaths mingling in the salty morning air. "No matter what comes next," I whispered, "I trust you." "You already have," he replied, voice low and steady, brushing a thumb across my cheek. And with that, the harbor seemed to still around us, the docks empty, the water calm, the past finally laid to rest. Later, we stood together on the restored deck of the yacht, not as a symbol of betrayal, but as a monument to our shared triumph. Our hands intertwined, Finn's thumb brushing against mine, and I rested my head against his chest, feeling the slow, steady rhythm of a heart that matched my own. The sun rose higher, casting golden light across the water, and I realized that I had traded a treacherous husband and conniving sister-in-law for something far more enduring, a man whose integrity and love could withstand any storm. In Finn's arms, I was finally home. The ocean stretched endlessly before us, vast and free, reflecting the life we would build together, anchored not in deceit, but in trust, passion, and unshakable devotion.